Freddie Mercury called it slavery. That is not a paraphrase. That is the word he used. Not exploitation, not unfair. Slavery. And the man on the other side of that accusation, Norman Sheffield, the manager who had signed Queen when nobody else would touch them, spent the rest of his life saying that what he did was simply business. Normal, standard, unremarkable business. Both of them believed what they said. Both of them had reasons to believe it. And the truth, the actual truth of what happened between Queen and Trident Audio Productions between 1972 and 1975 has been sitting in the space between those two words for 50 years, mostly untouched, mostly unexamined, mostly left to the careful silences of the surviving members of a band who learned, at considerable cost, exactly what it means to sign something when you are desperate. This is that story. London, 1972. Queen have been together for 2 years and have almost nothing to show for it. They are good. Everyone who has seen them live knows they are good. But good does not pay for studio time. Good does not pay rent. Freddie Mercury is selling vintage clothing from a stall at the Kensington Market. Brian May is trying to finish a physics degree while spending every available hour keeping a band alive that is consuming everything his degree requires. Roger Taylor is doing the same. John Deacon has just joined and is the youngest of them, all 20 years old, watching 3 older men hold together something that keeps threatening to fall apart. They are not starving, but they are not moving. The momentum that the early concerts had generated was beginning to dissipate in the specific way that momentum dissipates when the next structural step a record deal. A manager, someone with money and a plan, fails to arrive. The question by the middle of 1972 was not whether Queen were talented enough. The question was whether talent alone was going to be enough to keep the thing alive. Trident Audio Productions was not a small operation running on hope. Norman Sheffield and his brother Barry had built something real in Soho. Trident Studios on St. Anne's Court was where the Beatles had recorded Hey Jude in 1968. David Bowie had worked there. The equipment was serious. The connections were genuine. When the Sheffields offered Queen a development deal in 1972, what they put on the table was real. Studio access, a weekly allowance to keep the 4 of them alive while they made records, professional management, and the infrastructure that turns a promising band into a commercial one. None of that was invented. None of that was worthless. The Sheffields were experienced. They had seen bands come through their door before. They knew how to evaluate what they were looking at, and they were willing to make a substantial bet on 4 young musicians from London who had not yet made a record anyone had heard. The offer was genuine. The question that would take 3 years and a significant sum of money to fully answer was what it was going to cost. Nobody reads the small print when they are desperate. That is not a character flaw. It is just the mathematics of desperation. You need what is being offered more than you need to understand every clause of the document offering it. You sign because not signing means staying where you are, and where you are is not sustainable. Queen signed in 1972, and they were grateful to sign. The studios were real. The professionalism was real. The weekly money arrived. For a while it worked exactly as advertised. The first albums came. Queen in 1973, Queen 2, Sheer Heart Attack. 3 records in 2 years, each demonstrating that whatever this band was doing, it was not what anyone else was doing. The live reputation grew steadily. The concert venues got bigger. The profile rose in ways that were visible and measurable in press coverage, in ticket sales, in the specific quality of attention that the music industry pays to something it is beginning to understand it needs to take seriously. Sheer Heart Attack, released in late 1974, reached number 2 in the United Kingdom. It was reviewed with the kind of seriousness that had, until very recently, not been extended to Queen. The band was no longer a promising act. It was an established one. And through all of this, through 3 albums and 2 years of growing commercial and critical success, the 4 members of Queen received the same weekly allowance they had been receiving since 1972. The number had not changed. Everything around it had changed enormously. The number had not moved. By 1974, the gap between what Queen were generating and what they were receiving had stopped being abstract. It was in the bank statements. It was in the royalty accounting documents that arrived and were examined and produced expressions that Roger Taylor has described in interviews as the moment the band understood they had a serious problem. Not a creative problem, not a personal one, a structural one, written into a contract they had signed when they had no leverage and which they now had leverage, but which contained no mechanism for revisiting its terms in the light of changed circumstances. The contract said what it said. The contract had been signed, and the Sheffields were not doing anything the contract did not permit them to do. This is the thing that made Freddie Mercury's anger so specific and so sustained. It was not that anyone was obviously cheating. It was that the structure of the agreement made what was happening entirely legal. Every pound that should have been in their accounts and was not being stolen. It was being paid correctly to the people the contract said it should be paid to. The contract that had looked like a rescue in 1972 had become, 3 years later, something that Freddie Mercury could only describe in one word. Here is the thing about exploitation that makes it so difficult to argue about in retrospect. It almost never requires anyone to do anything wrong. It just requires the terms of an agreement, written when one party had all the power, to remain in force when the power has shifted. That is not malice. That is paperwork. Freddie Mercury did not spend a lot of time on paperwork. He spent his time on the word. The word was slavery. He said it in private conversations. He said it to the band. He said it with the specific quality of controlled fury that the people closest to him recognized as Freddie, at his most serious, not theatrical, not performed for effect, just absolutely clear. He was making a certain amount of money for other people and receiving a fraction of it back. He had signed a document that gave him no route out of that arrangement on terms he could unilaterally choose. He could not negotiate the rate upward. He could not leave without consequences. He could not change the terms because the terms were not his to change. He was, in the specific sense that mattered most to him, not free. That was the word. And once he had said it, the question of what to do about it became urgent in a way that no amount of careful management speak was going to soften. The situation required a solution, not a reframe, and the solution was going to require outside help. Brian May has a different memory of the same facts. He always has. Brian May is not the kind of person who reduces complicated things to a single word, and the Trident years are, in his various tellings across the decades, a more textured story than Freddie's version allows. He has acknowledged that the contract became untenable. He has also acknowledged, with a consistency that suggests genuine belief rather than diplomatic generosity, that what Trident provided in 1972 was real. That without the Sheffields, Queen might not have survived long enough to become the band they became. Both things are true, Brian May has always maintained. The exploitation and the rescue. The cage and the door that led to the cage. This is a harder position to sustain than Freddie's single word, and it requires a willingness to hold the humanity of people you are also in genuine conflict with. It is also probably closer to the full truth of what happened, which is not the full truth that Freddie wanted, and not the full truth that Norman Sheffield wanted either, but the specific, complicated, unsatisfying full truth of how the music industry has always worked. Roger Taylor's position was closer to Freddie's in temperature. He has described the Trident period with the specific impatience of someone who found the situation not just unjust, but increasingly absurd. A band that was clearly succeeding, being paid as though they were still the unknown act who had walked through Trident's door 3 years earlier. John Deacon, as he always did with contested internal Queen matters, said very little in public and contributed everything that was needed in private. But all four of them were unified on the only thing that ultimately mattered. They needed to get out. The question was how. The person who changed the situation was not a member of Queen, and not a lawyer, and not any kind of formal advocate for the band. He was a 24-year-old Scottish music manager named John Reid, who had already turned Elton John into one of the biggest recording artists in the world, and who understood the specific architecture of music industry contracts with the precision of someone who had spent years building them and dismantling them. When Reid looked at the Trident deal, he understood immediately what it contained, what it permitted, and most importantly, where its weaknesses were. and what it was going to take to end it on terms that were survivable for Queen. The negotiation that followed was not clean, and it was not quick. Both sides had legitimate positions. Both sides had something to lose. And the process of arriving at a settlement that allowed Queen to leave without litigation was, by the accounts of people close to it, the kind of sustained and difficult negotiation that leaves everyone involved tired and no one feeling entirely satisfied. But it was conclusive, and conclusive in 1975 was everything. Queen paid to be released from the Trident contract. The specific figure has appeared in various accounts in various amounts and has never been formally confirmed. But what is consistent across those accounts is that it was substantial a sum that the band paid from their own earnings in exchange for a document that said the relationship was over. The settlement was signed in 1975. The same year A Night at the Opera was released. The same year Bohemian Rhapsody reached #1 and stayed there for 9 weeks. The year Queen stopped being a band with a Trident problem and became simply and definitively one of the biggest acts in the world. The timing is not incidental. The freedom and the ascent happened in the same moment because they were, in a fundamental sense, the same thing. The specific creative and commercial energy that A Night at the Opera represents the ambition of it, the scale of it, the absolute refusal to compromise that produced Bohemian Rhapsody as a 6-minute single was not available to a band that was still negotiating its own value through a contract that gave it no leverage. The freedom produced the music. Or maybe the music had always been there, waiting for the freedom to let it out. Norman Sheffield published his version of the story in 2013, a book called Life on Two Legs, Set the Record Straight. The title tells you most of what you need to know about where he was starting from. 38 years after the contract was signed, 38 years of watching Queen become one of the most successful bands in history, and reading accounts of the Trident years that cast him and his brother as the architects of something close to exploitation. The book was his answer, his version, his right to tell the story from the side of it that nobody had asked for. Sheffield's argument was not without substance. Development deals in the early 1970s music industry routinely contained terms that contemporary practice would find indefensible, and what Trident offered was genuinely standard for the era, and for the risk involved investing in an unknown band in 1972 is a real gamble. And the terms that make the gamble worthwhile for the investor look very different once the investment has paid off at the level Queen paid off. Sheffield said he had spent real money, provided real support, taken a genuine risk on 4 young musicians who had nothing when he found them. He said Queen overstated the hardship of the Trident years and understated what Trident had provided. He said the word slavery was unfair to people who had done what they said they would do on terms that had been freely agreed. He was not entirely wrong, and he was also not the one who had been on the other side of the balance sheet. The Sheffields were operating within industry norms. Those norms had been designed over decades to extract maximum value from the people with minimum power. That Trident was acting within those norms did not make the norms acceptable. It just made them normal. Freddie Mercury's word was too strong, and Norman Sheffield's word was too mild. The truth lived between them, as these truths always do. What Freddie Mercury carried out of the Trident years was not just the memory of what the contract had cost. It was a permanent change in how he understood the world he worked in. He was never naive about money again. He was never willing to mistake the enthusiasm of someone with something to gain for disinterested support. Garden Lodge, the house he owned outright, that he left to Mary Austin in his will as the most private and most valuable thing he possessed was, among other things, the answer to Trident. What was his was his. He had learned the cost of that not being true. Every contract Queen signed after 1975 had a different quality to it. Every negotiation they entered carried the specific weight of people who had already paid for the most expensive lesson the music industry teaches. They had paid for it once. They made sure it was only once. Freddie Mercury called it slavery. Norman Sheffield called it business. 50 years later, both words still sit in the same room, unable to resolve the space between them, because that is where the actual story lives. Not in the villainy of one side or the innocence of the other. In the space between. where most of the truths worth knowing tend to live.